Today on I Dream of Words, we're talking about capitalization again. This is the second of two videos. Last time, we talked about how capitalization was born, and when it probably should have been killed. About 2,000 years ago, if you missed that one. This time, however, we're looking at when capitalization still needs to be used, and when it doesn't. Sadly, while educated people have likely already understood that capitalization is a useless traditional relic of ancient language, created to solve a problem that has long since ceased to exist, most haven't gone to the extent that they stop using it. English in this area, as almost all others, is crying for reform and modernization. Until that happens, though, when is capitalization necessary? There are two answers to this: when it's necessary within writing, and at what level of society. Generally, capitalization marks a document as being more formal. If you write a paper for class, whether as a child or at a university, it is expected, except if your professor is particularly enlightened about traditional English rules, that it use standard English capitalization. If you're writing a book, the same typically applies. If you write something for public consumption, instruction manuals, ads, articles, etc., your audience and your boss will likely expect, except for artistic reasons, standard capitalization. I know, this sounds like capitalization is expected everywhere you write, but that's not actually the case. You can think of it as being an academic and professional requirement. If you're writing something formally, it's definitely something most people will expect. If you're writing something informally, though, it's becoming more and more rare. Write an email? No caps. Text messages? Certainly not. Even if the email is to your boss or for your entire company, who cares about capital letters? It's really only the marketing stuff that anyone's going to be expecting that level of formality. You may be seeing a theme here. Capitalization in English is generally regarded as a high formality thing. Write a letter to your friends, digitally or, anachronistically, on paper, and your friends aren't likely to judge you for your formal capital letters any more than they will for your use of acronyms and emoji. Perhaps that's the best way to think of it then. If smileys and hearts and lols are acceptable in whatever you're writing, capital letters are certainly not required or even expected. But much of what you will write as a fluent English speaker is formal. Documents you write at work or school, for example, are a huge part of why you're looking at this language in the first place, I suspect. Let's look at where, when capital letters are relevant, they need to be used. There are two places. We'll look at the specifics in a moment, but the rule, and this isn't a simplified version, it's actually the whole rule, is that sentences and names begin with capital letters. I know what you're thinking. That can't be all there is to it. Spent countless hours being told this should be capitalized but that shouldn't? Looked at page after page of rules of when to use capital letters and when not to? Me too. Traditional style English textbooks, which are, summarily, all awful, by the way, waste countless pages in ink discussing this at a theoretical level and never get to the actual point. Capital letters begin sentences and names. That's it. But let's see what that means. The first part is pretty obvious if you've done any reading in English, which I assume you have, as you're listening to a fairly high-level discussion in the language, and we don't usually teach listening skills without a book in the modern world. If you have a sentence in formal English, it begins with a capital letter. How do you know where a sentence begins? It's either the beginning of the document, or the thing that comes after end punctuation. This is where people often get confused when it comes to punctuation. End punctuation is a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. That's it. Only those three. If you see any of those, the next letter needs to be a capital. If it's any other punctuation, comma, quotation marks, apostrophe, dash, or hyphen, it doesn't need to be. Other symbols also don't require capitalization. Asterisk, not to be confused with the similarly named graphic novel character, slash, backslash, ampersand, @ symbol, brackets, pipes, and currency symbols don't need them either. There are two other punctuations I've left out here, semicolon and colon, which are not end punctuation and, therefore, don't require capitalization either, but those are deprecated. If you are writing standard modern English, don't use them. Not ever. If you ask someone who specializes in grammar, there's one missing punctuation type from that list, the ellipsis. But realistically, that's just 3 periods in a row, so the same rule applies when there are 3 as when there's 1, capitalized after periods that end sentences. The first part, then, is agreeably simple. Why do people get so confused about capitalization in English, then, you might be thinking? Not so fast. The second rule takes a little more thought. Shakespeare, the most overrated of English authors in history, once asked, "What's in a name?" And this was quite possibly his greatest linguistic gift to English. The answer is that, in formal English, names are capitalized. Other words, unless they begin sentences, are not. But what exactly is a name? John, Mary, Charlotte, Victoria, Emily, James, Peter, Robert, and Jean. Those are names, and it's pretty obvious, so those are capitalized. United States of America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, France, Germany, China, Japan, Korea, Russia, and Spain. Also names, just names of places. English, French, German, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic, and Tamil. Names of languages or groups of people, so they too get the special treatment of big letters at the beginning. This is where people get a little curious though, and where English deviates from languages like French. It doesn't matter if they're nouns, I speak English, or adjectives, I love Spanish architecture, or for that matter any other word type. They are all capitalized if they are names. Some people will give these meaningless titles like proper nouns or proper adjectives, but that's just complicating an issue that's already far too confusing for something so simple. If it's a name, capitalize it. If it's not, don't. Which brings us to the part about religion. If you're a Christian, the actual official name of your deity, well, one of them at least, as there are several others, is God. It's not generalized, it's their actual name, so you capitalize it. If you're talking about gods in the general sense, though, it's no longer a name, so the word requires no capitalization. Let's look at an example to be completely clear. God created the heavens and earth. Capitalized God. In ancient times, people believed the gods lived on Mount Olympus. No capitalization required, because it's not a name, just a description like birds lived in the tree. That brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If it's the name of a place, much like a country, the name is also capitalized. Mount Rushmore and Mount Fuji, River Nile and Chesapeake Bay, Pacific Ocean and Inland Sea. You might shop on the corner of Pearl Avenue and Jade Street. What do these all have in common? They are the names of those locations, so, being names, they require capitalization. The other place confusion tends to happen is when someone is called by a designation rather than a name, but the rule is quite simple when you think of it this way. Hey boss, how are you doing? No capitalization required, because, thankfully, it's very unlikely your boss is actually named Boss. Hi mom, where do you want to go for dinner? Again, no capitalization is required. The only exception to this rule, though it's not really an exception at all, but you might want to think of it as one, is when it's an honorific prefix, like Mr. or Miss, or Aunt or Uncle. When those words are used on their own, Mr. and Miss aren't, but Aunt and Uncle certainly are, they aren't names. But often a child will think of those as part of the person's name, Aunt Irene and Uncle Douglas, rather than my aunt or their uncle. In those cases, as with Mr. Smith and Miss Stewart, the honorific is capitalized. Why? Because it's actually part of their name in this usage, which means it is just following the simple rule we already looked at. Capitalization is certainly outdated and useless, but that doesn't mean it's complicated or difficult to use. Just remember, if it's formal writing, sentence beginnings and names are capitalized. That's really all there is to it. That's all there is for this time. Thanks for listening.